Good afternoon, grasshoppers. It's Sunday and it's now in the afternoon, and I wanted to touch base with you concerning your assignments in chapters 5 and 6. So we're going to just briefly chat about that. In the assignments, you'll notice that there's a language TED Talk, and I found this to be very important for not only how critical our language is, but the mechanisms of how you're communicating and the inferences and the extensions of what you're communicating. So the particular types of language that you use, et cetera, et cetera. I think you're going to find that to be a worthwhile TED Talk. I happen to be a big fan of TED Talks. I think they contain a lot of philosophy and ethics in a fairly short period of time. Um, the discussion board that I have you doing this week is uh, from a professor that I have a great deal of respect for. And so the article on Socrates is one of the great dictums that comes out of Socrates is know thyself. It seems very clear to me that if you don't know who you are, if you don't know what you're about, you're at a serious handicap in terms of relationships, in terms of work, in terms of any number of things. So this, I think, is a very important article for you to read, and you know, take the questions that I'm asking you seriously, not just from an exercise position, but from your own self-reflection. I think that that's very important. Um, the obedience and ethics, that is a really good exercise on the Milgram experiments that were done, and and what it's really chatting about, I think, is how does it get the normal person to commit acts that may be considered not only unethical but simply pretty destructive. And so this is an important exercise on obedience and ethics. We have a tendency to fail to recognize how obedient human beings can become. And as I like to stress in my class, the notion of existential authenticity is what genuinely allows you to escape that notion of being um, obedient to the position of being a slave, if you would, um, to an ideology, to a dictator, to a political system, or um, uh, things of that nature. You fill in the blanks. The last part here is chapter 5 and 6. I'm just going to basically touch on them. Absolutism versus realism in chapter, relativism in chapter 5 goes back to obedience and ethics. It goes back to Socrates. It goes back to language and all of those types of things. And so we have uh, run into situations in world history where absolutism has run amok. And I think that what is important for us to see is how quickly it is to fall prey to an absolutist mindset, such that you're unable to see the validity or the value of an alternate position, an alternate system, things of that nature. The Chinese are going through that right now in Hong Kong, and it's problematic. In the United States, for example, we live under a relative free society. You're not free to do anything you want, but you are relatively free to follow your own lights, to pursue your own sense of happiness, so long as you don't infringe on the rights of other people. Makes pretty good sense. Well, there are those that disagree with that. And so, in a brief sort of summary of relativism, relativism really comes about from an anthropological perspective. And Margaret Mead is one who really generated a strong interest in this relativist position. When she went to Samoa and she discovered the sexual preferences and the sexual enculturation and socialization that young children went through, and just made observations. But from those observations, she concluded that it is um, it is incorrect to try to judge culture, a different culture, from the window of your own culture or the value structure of your own culture. So when Americans, as an example, when we look at the Chinese or the Russians or the Brazilians or the Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert, um, it is incorrect to judge their value structure, their cultural habits, and things of that nature from the perspective of our own. We need to view that from within their own culture. So anthropologists today, they immerse themselves in a different culture when they go to study them. That way they're able to sort of see their cultural values from within their culture. And then you can make judgments. Now, the contra position to that, to a strong relativistic perspective, is that are there rules, ethical rules that are universal in nature and that ought to be adhered to by all cultures. So on page 53, your author chats a little bit about that, and uh, I think he's pretty clear about it. The only thing I would suggest to you is that um, there are universal values. One of them is the incest taboo. So, from a sociological or an anthropological perspective, all cultures have a variation of the incest taboo. Incest, of course, is not having sexual activity with members of your own family, so to speak. Um, in the United States, for example, we have very strong notions of the incest taboo that go to who you're allowed to marry. So, for example, the last time I checked, I, you know, I don't know that your first cousin, you can legally marry your first cousin. I think your second cousin you can. Um, you can't marry your brother or your sister. Things of that nature. So it falls into the scope of marriage, and which is, you know, fill in the blanks. And but we is that a universal proposition of not marrying your first cousin and not inbreeding with your siblings and things, or your parents and things of that nature? There are certain cultures that don't subscribe to that. And even in the United States, for example, there are segments of the population that feel it's okay to do that. So the incest notion there is it just okay? And yet, in terms of strict incest between, say, parents and children or siblings, there's some serious biological reasons not to do that. And so we can have a rational explanation of why these behaviors ought not to occur, just so that you're aware of that. Um, The on page 54 and 55, propositions, states of affairs, and your you know your author does a pretty good job. It seems to me that we become confused when we're looking at propositions are meaningful statements describing states of affairs, and they must either be true or false. As I look out my window, it's either sunny or it's not. Um, a state of affairs is an occurrence, an event, or happening. It is neither true or false. It either occurs or it does not. A proposition is a state of affairs. A proposition describes a state of affairs. So we have a tendency to look at states of affairs and propositions as sometimes synonymous terms, and they're not. And we need to be very careful. Let us go back to language, the notion that we're talking about. And then your author talks about, are there any absolute truths? Uh, Are there? Are there absolute truths? Yes, there are. And if we look at the chapter, for example, they talk about analytic truths. Analytic propositions are true by definition. So, for example, a square has four equal sides. That is an analytic proposition. 2 plus 2 equals 4 is an analytic proposition, in that if you come up with 2 plus 2 equals 5, the challenge is with your computation, not with the arithmetic. So in terms of logic, you cannot have A and not A at the same time. Those are absolute phenomena, absolute truths. You cannot have A and not A at the same time. And so once again, I think that your author does a good job of this. Let us not, though, confuse analytic propositions with moral indictments. The thou shalt not kill is a relativistic proposition, and it seems clear to me that if I'm going to engage in killing as a preservation of my own human life or the life of my family and things of that nature, that can be a warranted, justified notion of killing. And the law reflects that. So the notion that under no circumstance, a Kantian notion, if we will, a deontological position, that killing ought to never occur, um, that would only make sense if you had the first formulation of the categorical imperative that it ought to be universal, i.e., that everybody subscribed to that, which we clearly know is not the case. So, um, the one of the things I also want to chat about is chapter 6 and the notion of freedom versus determinism. If you're subscribing to a deterministic proposition in terms of life, it means that everything is determined in your life, and if that's the case, then you have no freedom. For your behavior is already determined either through your genetic code or through a divine providence or something of that nature. But freedom in the face of determinism is a misnomer. And we have a tendency not to want to subscribe to that. We want to subscribe to the idea that we're free. Well, as any first year philosophy student will tell you, that is a very dubious claim, because you're begging the question of what does it mean to be free. And I like the analogy of looking at freedom within particular parameters. So you cannot transcend your existence, if you know what I mean. You can't go to another dimension and things of that nature. So that's the parameters, or one of the parameters that you are ensconced in. So within those parameters, you are free. And what the existentialist will argue, Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre, even Kierkegaard, um, and to some degree Friedrich Nietzsche, the the parameters that you are ensconced in are really your own making. So you formulate those parameters. You formulate the dictates of your own existence and your own life and how you're going to behave. Go back to virtue ethics, for example, and your character is the determining factor of how you're going to behave. But within that character, you are free to, engage life however you see fit. So these become very important notions. And you need to understand that there are those thinkers who argue that from a biological perspective, from a genetics perspective, if you will, you are not free. That you may behave only in the wishes of your genetic code. Now, that's a pretty extreme position. And we have a tendency to say the choices, those folks are arguing that the choices that you're making, given the data, your mind, your genetic code, which is then interfaced with the culture, the whole nature versus nurture interface, will argue that you simply cannot choose other than what you do. Now, that's a very tough place to escape from. The choices that you make are determined by any number of factors. But is there a position where you can escape that, where you can say, yes, I have a degree of genuine freedom. I can choose between these two options. Let me, if I may, give you the absurd notion that the choice between heaven and hell is not really a choice. No one in their right mind would ever choose to spend eternity in Dante's fourth level of the Inferno, if you know what I mean. So it seems clear to me, if we go back to our parameters phenomena, the choice between two viable options is an indicator, is an instance where you can have genuine choice. Do I want this particular piece of candy or this particular piece of candy? At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. It's just, which do I prefer at this moment, and do I want some chocolate, or do I want, some different kind of candy or something of that nature? Well, we look at those very elementary types of choices, and let us go up the scale, up the ladder, if we will, to notions of, do I choose this person as a partner, or do I choose this person as a partner? Do I choose to engage these types of sexual behaviors? Do I choose this? You see where it becomes infinitely more complicated. And the degree to which we have a broad education in terms of science, in terms of ethics, in terms of history, in terms of sociology, society, and psychology, is a degree to which we escape the deterministic net that folks want to put you in. As I've shared with you before, um, the ignorant do not make choices. The ignorant simply react. They simply respond to the particular data there isn't a great deal of critical thinking that goes on that allows them to transcend the deterministic kind of notion that folks want to strap you into. And I am a great adherent of the idea that the educated, they are the ones that are able to make decisions. And that, of course, is about being free. The freedom to choose, the freedom to decide how you want to live your life, the freedom to choose the among the host of variables that are presented to you. Which ones are going to be the best for you right now, down the road, way down the road? How are those choices that you're making today going to affect those dimensions of your life? So that's where I think these two chapters really come into play. We don't want to fall into the category of a fatalistic position where you are simply unable to have any sort of discernment in your life whatsoever. That would that would place you surely in the realm of almost inanimate objects. The last thing I wanted to chat with you about is a number of years ago, I remember there was a big debate going on that humans don't have instinct, and I disagreed with that profusely. And I argue that yes, human beings do have some instinctual mechanisms. Um, no one has to really teach you about sex, for example. You instinctually know how to do that. When you're born as a brand new infant, no one has to teach you how to feed at your mother's breast. You instinctually know how to do that. So human beings do have some instincts, but we are not considered instinctual animals. So the lion, for example, doesn't think or contemplate or reflect on, well, let me see, should I get that antelope? Let me think about that. No, that's not the way that lower animals operate. They are instinctual animals. So that's their modus operandi. Here again is a line of demarcation between lower forms of animals and the human condition. Educated humans have the ability to think, to critically think, and to discern and make decisions. And at the end of the day, that is one of the great values of critical thinking and education. And so I sort of close with that. I looked over your work that you've done so far in terms of the quizzes and stuff. You're doing a bang up job. Just a bang up job. I'm just very pleased with what's going on. Now this week you've got a bit of writing to do, and so you're gonna want to get in on that and get that taken care of. Once again, I think you're doing a good job, and I have enjoyed looking over your work. So I look forward to this week. And I just think there's so many critical elements that come out of this particular week for us. Once again, if you have any questions, drop me a line. And I hope you folks have a great week. It's going to be toasty out there, sports fans. So make sure you're careful. Get to the pool, though. There you go. Talk to you soon.